Week 46, Day 1. Ascertain. Discover, find out about.
In order to ascertain the relationship between his girlfriend and his brother, he kept a wary and discreet vigil.
Dormant. Resting, asleep.
He was appalled at the apathy concerning the important issue that had remained dormant for so long a time.
Burgeoned. Flourished, grew.
While some moribund economies atrophied after World War II, others burgeoned under the salubrious effects of loans from the U.S.
Potentate. Ruler.
The callous potentate kept an imperturbable mien when requested to alleviate the unconscionable conditions existing in his land.
Disseminate. Spread, scatter.
We are quick to disseminate calumny, but reticent about things that may be construed as compliments.
Straight from the shoulder. In a direct, open way.
I took the wind out of his sails by telling him straight from the shoulder that I was not going to wink at his apple polishing.
A mighty empire. One of the anomalies of our approach to history is the propensity to study the venerable empires of Europe, but we do not feel it incumbent upon us to ascertain anything about the civilizations in our own hemisphere. We deprecate the history of this part of the world, as though progress lay dormant and that other peoples were irrelevant until the settlers of North America arrived at Plymouth Rock. In South America, from 2000 BC until their empire reached its acme, at the beginning of the 16th century, lived the Incas. The site of the capital city of the Inca Empire, Cusco, lay at a height of 11,000 feet. This civilization is reputed to have burgeoned until it covered more than 2,500 miles of the western part of the continent. Its population fluctuated between 4 and 7 million. This empire had a highly efficacious political and social system. Its potentate ruled with absolute power. As the empire conquered new lands, it would disseminate its language, religion, and social customs.
Week 46, Day 2. Derived. Descended from, received from a source.
A pragmatic philosopher derived the theory that we have noses in order to hold up our eyeglasses.
Prerogative. An exclusive right or power.
He gave his adversary the dubious prerogative of choosing the weapon by which he was to meet his inevitable end.
Nepotism. Favoritism toward relatives.
Your efforts to ingratiate yourself into your boss's favor are nullified by the unmitigated nepotism manifest in this firm.
Dearth. Scarcity, lack.
In the potpourri of restaurants there is no dearth of succulent dishes.
Internecine. Involving conflict within a group, mutually destructive.
The emissary from the president tried to allay the fears that a deleterious internecine feud was inevitable within the party.
To rub a person the wrong way. To do something that irritates or annoys.
The quickest way to rub a person the wrong way is to give him the cold shoulder.
A battle for power. The Inca emperor derived his prodigious power and authority from the gods. The paramount god was the sun god. It was from him the ruler passed on his prerogative, to rule to his most astute son. This nepotism had worked with great efficacy for centuries. The land holdings were immense, there were rich farmlands and llamas and alpacas for wool. Precious metals were plentiful: silver, copper, bronze, and the most sacred of all, gold. This metal resembled the sun god whom they extolled. There was no dearth of idols and ornaments hammered from this gleaming metal. There was always more gold coming from the mines to replenish the supply. At the acme of his power, the Inca ruler died without naming the requisite successor. In 1528, two sons began an internecine struggle for control. For the next 4 years the empire sank into the lassitude caused by civil war.
Week 46, Day 3. Tyro. Beginner, novice.
Although he was erudite about a copious number of things, he was a naive, callow tyro when it came to relating to girls.
Sophistry. False reasoning or argument.
Her sophistry made use of every glib artifice.
Factitious. Sham, artificial.
In the office he played the factitious role of a martinet, while at home he was filled with compassion.
Encomium. High praise.
The modest prodigy treated the fervid encomiums that followed his performance as though they were a mere bagatelle.
Obloquy. Disgrace, shame, dishonor.
John Wilkes Booth's egregious act remains an infamous obloquy.
To draw in one's horns. To become cautious.
He knew he was out of his depth, so he drew in his horns and quit the poker game.
A perfidious conqueror. The feuding between the rival sons reached its pinnacle in 1532. At that moment Francisco Pizarro came onto the scene. A native of Spain, he was sojourning in Panama, when he heard of the riches to be found in that far-off land. Overwhelmed with cupidity, but still a tyro when it came to wresting power and wealth from hapless people, he joined with an inveterate adventurer. They gathered a small band of mercenaries. The first 2 attempts failed, and Pizarro returned to Spain to request authority and money in order to conquer the west coast of South America. Whether by sophistry or cajolery, he was given the requisite aid. With a force of 180 men, the dregs of society, he invaded Inca territory. He reached the city where the current ruler, Atahualpa, was holding court. The Incas welcomed Pizarro who, in a factitious display of friendship, heaped encomiums upon Atahualpa. Unknown to the Incas, Pizarro had brought guns that were still beyond the technology of these people. The obloquy of his next act, ambushing the Incas and taking Atahualpa prisoner, will live in the history books that are replete with tales of conquest.
Week 46, Day 4. Hyperbole. Exaggerated figure of speech.
The rhetoric soared into flagrant hyperbole.
Munificent. Generous.
He was surprised by the munificent gratuity given by the usually parsimonious termagant.
Prevarication. Deviation from the truth, lying.
Her constant prevarication made her a pariah to her friends.
Charisma. Quality of leadership inspiring enthusiasm.
Even those who were not fans of the movie star candidly admit the charisma that surrounded him.
Genocide. Planned destruction of an entire people.
The United Nations has outlawed genocide as the ultimate crime, which must be eradicated.
To throw cold water. To discourage a plan or idea.
I was going to pull up stakes and move out lock, stock, and barrel, but my wife threw cold water on the whole thing.
The end of an empire. The Machiavellian Pizarro held the captured Atahualpa for ransom. He was adamant about receiving a room filled with gold, to the height of a man's shoulder. This was taken as a hyperbole at first, but Pizarro knew the gullible Incas would be munificent when it came to rescuing their sacred ruler. They did not procrastinate, and a frenetic collection of gold took place. Pizarro, to whom prevarication was natural in dealing with the Incas, had no qualms about executing their ruler, as soon as he had the gold. The Inca Empire was moribund, but the charisma that surrounded Atahualpa was such that, after his death, the Incas fought on tenaciously in his name for several years. Eventually, superior weapons quelled all opposition. A policy of genocide was adopted by the Spanish conquerors, and almost 2 million of these proud people died in the carnage that followed. The saga of an ancient civilization thus came to an end.
Week 47, Day 1. Impregnable. Incapable of being entered.
A company of Marines was unable to penetrate the seemingly impregnable fortress.
Toxic. Harmful.
Coal miners are often subject to toxic fumes.
Extenuating. Excusable.
Robert's defense lawyer pointed out the extenuating conditions of the case.
Neophyte. Beginner.
Although Sarah was skillful at math, she was a neophyte at computers.
Patriarch. Elder.
Grandfather is the recognized patriarch of our family.
A dry run. Trial, test, exercise.
Before opening night, the actors had several dry runs.
Titanic Mystery. On April 14, 1912, an incident took place that became a front-page story in newspapers all over the world. It is a tale that has continued to capture the attention of movie and theater goers, of opera and television audiences, of novelists and playwrights. It's the story of the allegedly impregnable Titanic, the unsinkable majestic ocean liner, that tumbled to the bottom of the icy Atlantic waters, with 1,600 passengers still aboard. How could such a toxic tragedy have occurred? Could it have been avoided? How could the naval patriarch, Captain Edward Smith, no neophyte, he have allowed the disaster to happen? What were the extenuating circumstances that led to the death of that glorious White Star Queen? In September 1985, the hulk of the Titanic was found on the ocean's floor, providing many answers to the questions that seamen and landlubbers had wrestled with over the years.
Week 47, Day 2. Forebodings. Premonitions, evil omens.
Caesar's wife had foreboding about danger facing her husband.
Emanating. Coming from.
The rulings emanating from the local court were cheered by the conservatives.
Miscreant. One who behaves badly.
The class miscreant was made to remain after school.
Protocol. Forms of ceremony.
Failing to follow protocol got Sophia into trouble at the office.
Circuitous. Roundabout.
Cindy took a circuitous route home to avoid the class bullies.
To throw someone a curve. To do the unexpected.
When I least expected it, Helen threw me a curve.
What went wrong? Investigators found that a series of mistakes led to the sinking of the Titanic. A wireless message had come in from a French liner, warning of ice ahead, but that was 1,000 miles away, and so, no need to worry. On April 13, the vessel Raffenach also warned the Titanic of dangerous ice ahead. On the following day, there came a spate of other warnings from a Cunard ship, a Dutch liner, and the White Star Baltic, all telling of icebergs about 250 miles from the Titanic's current position. Next came the German America, echoing the same forebodings, followed by the California, cautioning the Titanic about the field ice. Finally, the Mesaba called attention to an enormous belt of ice, stretching directly across the Titanic's path. All the messages emanating from sister ships should have had a profound effect on Smith and Company. No one miscreant could be fingered, but a host of crew members were certainly blameworthy. Why didn't Captain Smith's officers react to those messages? Notations were indeed made on slips of paper, but largely ignored and forgotten. There was no standard protocol for the handling of such messages. If there had been, Captain Smith would certainly have taken a circuitous route, so as to avoid the dangerous icebergs.
Week 47, Day 3. Knell. Sound of a bell.
When the knell sounded, the students closed their books and their minds.
Macabre. Gruesome.
Some critics were unhappy about the bloody macabre scenes in the movie.
Ramifications. Complications.
Heidi was concerned about the ramifications of her employer's new policy.
Rapacious. Greedy, taking by force.
The rapacious dictator used mustard gas against his enemies.
Insurgent. Rebellious.
Additional troops were dispatched to deal with the insurgent threat.
To cross the Rubicon. A limit that allows for no return.
When I crossed the Rubicon by signing the contract, I knew I could never go back on my commitment.
Death knell for the Titanic. And then it happened. White in its innocence, a monstrous iceberg smashed into the luxury liner, ripping an ugly gash of 250 feet along the starboard, and causing a fatal wound. Within seconds, thousands of cubic feet of water had penetrated the shattered hull. One after another, domino-like, the watertight compartments and bulkhead were flooded. The unthinkable had happened, despite the absolute guarantees of the shipbuilders, Harland and Wolff. There followed a macabre scene as the ship's band, clad in their tuxedos, continued to play show tunes while hordes of terrified passengers, many in nightclothes, rushed toward the lifeboats. The crew called out, women and children first, but their lack of an orderly plan for loading would have profound ramifications. In fact, some boats that could hold 30 were sent into the Atlantic with only a handful of people, generally first-class passengers. As panic began to take hold, the realization that there weren't enough lifeboats exacerbated the situation, bringing out the worst in a rapacious few. Several insurgent males ignored the crew and jumped into descending lifeboats. It was an act of shame they would have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Week 47, Day 4. Glut. Oversupply.
Our choir has a glut of tenors and a shortage of sopranos.
Risible. Laughable.
What Harry felt was risible, Sally thought was pathetic.
Dilatory. Delaying.
Umpires do not like pitchers who use dilatory styles.
Specious. Deceptively attractive.
In debating, specious arguments are rarely effective.
Denouement. Outcome.
The play's denouement came with 3 dead bodies on the stage.
To brave the elements. To go out in bad weather.
Despite the freezing rain, Cynthia decided to brave the elements.
The lawyer's turn. As one might have expected, manifold lawsuits against the White Star Line began to crop up within weeks of the sinking and rescue. The glut of billionaires on board, Astors, Wideners, Guggenheims, Strausses, et al., did not file any claims, but other cases went all the way to the Supreme Court and kept lawyers and judges busy for the next 4 years. The average claim had been for a modest $1,500, and the average award, paid by the White Star Line, was a risible $1,000. White Star's top-notch legal staff was accused of using dilatory tactics, tiring the claimants until they agreed to settle for a mere pittance. Their lawyers called many claims specious, and rejected them out of hand. The denouement of the story is rather sad. American and British maritime law had long given special protection to ship owners on the grounds that their business was such a risky one. And so there was a limit to the amount of money that White Star could be assessed. In the end, they paid only 4% of the $16 million originally demanded by the survivors, and were happy to close the books on the ocean disaster. We can imagine that if a similar tragedy were to take place today, the settlements would be in the hundreds of millions.
Week 48, Day 1. Dolorous. Sad.
We were surprised when Ted's happy expression turned into a dolorous one.
Enervated. Worn out.
Enervated by his long walk, Jose took to his bed.
Suffrage. Right to vote.
The dictator lied when he claimed he favored suffrage for women.
Cabal. Secret group of plotters.
The members of the revolutionary cabal were arrested and jailed.
Odious. Despicable.
Sylvia's odious remarks caused the audience to turn against her.
To kill the goose that laid the golden egg. To spoil a good deal.
By being greedy, the accountant killed the goose that laid the golden egg.
Good news and bad. On Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant sent a terse dispatch to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. It contained the long-awaited sentence that the Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered. The dolorous Civil War that had crippled the young nation was finally over. President Lincoln was only 56 at the time, but he looked 20 years older. The burden of being a wartime president had so enervated Lincoln that Surgeon General Barnes feared an imminent nervous breakdown. When Grant's news reached Lincoln, he went to the front windows of the White House and waved to the crowd below. He proceeded to make a brief speech about the problems of Reconstruction and advocated the granting of suffrage to Negro soldiers. Among the listeners was a Southern patriot, the popular actor John Wilkes Booth, almost as famous in the theater as his father, Junius. "That's the last speech he will ever make," said Booth to a fellow member of his cabal of conspirators. Booth's odious plan was to assassinate Lincoln, whom he hated passionately, while an associate, George Atzerodt, would do the same to Vice President Andrew Johnson.
Week 48, Day 2. Prescient. Able to predict.
Claiming to be prescient, the fortune teller took advantage of the gullible woman.
Verbatim. Word for word.
With remarkable talent, the reporter was able to quote speeches verbatim.
Reverie. Dream.
In her reverie, Ellen saw herself as the next U.S. president.
Thespian. Actor.
Yearning to be a thespian, Roger took lessons from a dramatic coach.
Despot. Tyrant.
When he lost control of the militia, the despot was forced to flee.
To carry coals to Newcastle. A waste of time.
Telling the racing car driver how to drive is like carrying coals to Newcastle.
The dreams of Lincoln and Booth. Lincoln's family and friends remembered that the president had a prescient dream in March, several weeks before the fatal day, and provided them with a verbatim account. He told of entering the East Room, in the White House, where a throng of people were gathered around an open coffin. In his reverie, Lincoln asked a soldier, "Who is dead in the White House?" "The president," was the reply. "He was killed by an assassin." Mrs. Lincoln said, "I'm glad I don't believe in dreams, or I should be in terror from this time forth." Lincoln's was the calming voice, "Let's try to forget it. I think the Lord in His own good time and way, will work this out all right." Of course, all who loved Abe Lincoln would have been deeply agitated, if they had known what John Wilkes Booth was planning. As a Southern secessionist, he despised the president. As a thespian, he romanticized the action that he could take to rid the nation of a cruel warmonger. Although he had not taken an active part in the Civil War, he was convinced that he could contribute to the Confederate cause by kidnapping the bearded despot. It wasn't exactly clear in his mind whether he would capture Lincoln and take him to Richmond, where he could be exchanged for Confederate prisoners of war, or whether he would just put a bullet in the president's head.
Week 48, Day 3. Pathological. Disordered in behavior.
The defense lawyer admitted that his client was a pathological liar.
Articulate. Well-spoken.
Hal was surprisingly articulate for a high school freshman.
Grandeur. Magnificence.
In history class, we studied the grandeur of Greece and the glory of Rome.
Polemic. Controversial argument.
The team captain's polemic led to a fist fight in the locker room.
Impasse. Deadlock.
The impasse was broken when the union agreed to management's offer.
An axe to grind. To pursue a selfish aim.
Senator Smith was in favor of the bill, but we knew that he had an axe to grind.
The assassins make ready. The pathological yet articulate Booth had rounded up several co-conspirators, and shared his delusions of grandeur with them. He had produced a polemic that convinced his crew that it would be a patriotic thing to capture the president. One of them was assigned to shut off the master gas valve, at Ford's Theater, when Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln were seated there at the play. With all the lights out, Booth would bind and gag the president. Two men would lower Lincoln onto the stage, and then carry him out the rear door, to a covered wagon waiting in the alley. They would head for Port Tobacco, and then ferry across the Potomac to their ultimate destination, Richmond, Virginia. Several dry runs had not worked out for the Cabalists, who were about to reach an impasse, when Booth learned that Lincoln would be celebrating General Grant's victories, with a party at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th. He promised the small group that destiny was at hand. Their bold act, he said, would make their names famous forever in the annals of U.S. history. In the late afternoon of April 14th, Booth watched a rehearsal of the play that would be performed that evening. He had reviewed his action plan and the escape route, and he believed it to be foolproof. He mouthed the phrase he would use after killing Lincoln, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. The curtain was about to go up, on one of the darkest days in the country's history.
Week 48, Day 4. Regimen. A system of control.
Aunt Ethel's morning regimen called for 3 cups of coffee.
Denigrated. Defamed.
When her boss denigrated Martha's stenographic ability, she quit.
Guile. Trickery.
Using guile, the magician pulled the wool over the spectators' eyes.
Mortal. Leading to death.
The blow to the boxer's jaw turned out to be a mortal one.
Inflicted. Imposed upon.
The prison guards inflicted torture on some of the inmates.
To throw one's hat in the ring. To run for political office.
Before a gathering of the party's faithful, the local congressman threw his hat in the ring for the position of senator.
Now he belongs to the ages. At 8:25, the Lincolns arrived at the theater. When they entered booths 7 and 8, as regimen dictated, the band played Hail to the Chief. The 1675 members of the audience stood to honor the great man, and then the play commenced. It is reported that Booth said to a drunk, who had denigrated his acting skill, "When I leave the stage, I will be the most famous man in America." At about 10 p.m., with extreme guile, Booth had managed to be behind box 7 in the darkness of the hallway. He saw the silhouette of a head above the horsehair rocker. Derringer in his hand, he aimed it between the president's left ear and his spine. The shot was drowned out by laughter on the stage. Shouting revenge for the South, Booth climbed over the ledge of the box and jumped onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. In pain, Booth limped out the stage door, where his horse was waiting, and made his getaway. Days later, however, he was cornered in a Virginia barn and shot. 3 of the cabal members were arrested and hanged. At the theater, a 23-year-old doctor attended to the wounded president. He found that the lead shot had lodged in Lincoln's brain, a bad sign. Several soldiers carried Mr. Lincoln across the street to a private house. His family physician came, and so did the Surgeon General. The president struggled throughout the long night, but it was apparent that a mortal wound had been inflicted, and he could not be saved. At 7:22 a.m., it was over. 2 silver coins were placed on the assassinated president's eyes. Then Secretary Stanton uttered the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages."